Thank you for joining us on the Winning at Selling podcast. I'm Professor Scott Plum of the Minnesota Sales Institute, and with me is Bill Hellkamp of Reach Development Systems.
Is there a difference between a sales situation and a crisis situation? Do they both require strategic communication techniques? Chances are you haven't often thought of a sales call and a crisis communication the same way, but you might after this podcast. Fortunately, we're not in a crisis mode, because Scott and I are welcoming crisis communication expert Paul Omodt to discuss people and the stories they sell on episode 578 of the Winning at Selling podcast.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Paul, and I think about a crisis situation, and we're in the last week of the month for those of you that are playing along at home and listening to us in real time. And I always consider the last week of the month as a crisis situation when you've got monthly goals and in some cases quarterly goals.
That's usually the crisis happens because you didn't work the first 2 weeks.
It's the behavior. It boils down to the behavior. We see the crisis and the lack of results. But before we get into the conversation with Paul, there is no book club today. So How to Win Friends and Influence People. We're on chapters 4, 5, and 6 from part 4. And we'll be covering that next week. And then the following week, we'll be finishing up the book. So stay tuned for more. We're going to be doing spin selling after this book by Neil Rackham. So
yeah, that'll be good.
Your book list. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Paul.
All right. Well, let me introduce our guest. Paul is the founder and principal at Omodt and Associates Critical Communications. He named it after himself. That's good.
It is.
A full-service communication firm based in the Twin Cities that clients call on when communication is critical to their success. Paul is known for his work helping clients deal with critical communications when the situation is fast-moving or slower to develop. He is also a go-to strategist for communication clients looking to sell large-scale, competitively bid projects where his clients regularly find success when they connect and tell the better story. Paul, welcome to the Winning at Selling podcast.
Thanks for having me today.
It's nice to have you. The title of it you wanted us to call it was People and the Stories They Sell. So let's start there. What does that mean? Let's give us a broader context of this crisis communication and stories.
Well, let's back it up and start the story back with young Paul, okay? Because I'm going to introduce some characters today. I'm going to introduce young Paul and young Scott, and so we can use some examples here. But young Paul grew up in a household where kind of stories were assembled every day. So I grew up in a household where my dad was the county sheriff here in Hennepin County, which is the biggest county in Minnesota, and we had a police scanner going on every floor of the house. So we always had to know kind of what was going on in the county. So you'd listen to a call come in, you'd hear what dispatch sent out, and then you would see or hear on the news how it was portrayed in the media, right? And so what that was doing was forming a very intimate story that you could follow. So rather than watching TV, right, we actually could watch the scanner and listen to how that played out. And you start to see the narratives develop and how narratives develop on different things and how you can change elements of the narrative to sell a different story. And so you would see how different media outlets did it. You would see how different officers did it, or ambulance drivers or whatever. And so really what I got in tune to at a young age. So young Paul learned very quickly that there is a narrative that goes with something and it moves people. And so really what you were trying to figure out is how to assemble that. And so really, I grew up that way, and I obviously morphed over time into something I do professionally for a living. But the more you think about it, really, we are selling a story. And whether you're selling a story from an incident or some activity that happened or a big product, it's kind of the same process. So there's a lot of similarities between what I do as a communications consultant and what you guys do as sales consultants, as salespeople.
Wow, that's a broad definition of it, and I can see where it's very relevant when it comes to really getting into situations where a solution is part of a crisis and really getting somebody to move them emotionally to make a difference and to maybe take a risk and even step outside their comfort zone, which can be a crisis. Can you give us kind of an example of a situation that has created a crisis and then a good outcome because they were dealing with somebody that was really walking the process and delivering a solution that people could really value from?
Well, there's kind of the classic example in crisis communications, and it kind of encompasses everything that I talk about in terms of this. So what I've done in my career is I've developed my own system, and I make it simple, and I call it the claim it, name it, frame it system. So it rhymes. It's like a Dr. Seuss
Mm.
story, right? And so it's about how you claim a crisis, how you define it, how you name it, that kind of goes into people's minds, and then how you frame it up using communications and or sales techniques. So think about this, and I use this example frequently, is you can think about a big disaster that happened, right? And most people can tell me, people of our age especially, they'll remember the oil tanker that crashed up in Alaska.
Yes.
And right away, they're going to tell me what, Scott? They're going to think, oh,
It's the Exxon Valdez.
the Exxon Valdez.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about that just for a minute. Why do we know the name of the company involved? Right?
Because of the media
Because of the media, and because they were slow to use communications techniques to not have Exxon attached to the crash.
Mm.
You look at other things in the same category. You look at the nuclear meltdown that we had just a few years before that in the United States that could have wiped out the East Coast of the United States. And most people will come up with it a little bit of time, and they'll come up with 3 Mile Island.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
They won't be able to name the company, however.
Mm.
So what the company was smart enough to do, which was Con Edison, was to name the crisis by location, whereas the Exxon Valdez wasn't named the Prince William Sound spill.
Huh. Right.
Mm.
And those two dynamics kind of frame everything you think. So in the one story, Exxon is the bad actor, and the other story, 3 Mile Island, is the bad actor because it's the location of the city.
Mm.
And so it has two different powers, and that is actually the power of naming a crisis. The problem, Scott, that you mentioned was that the media framed the story because Exxon didn't claim it first.
Mm.
So in any crisis situation, there's this concept we call the golden hour, which is kind of that claiming process of a crisis where we say, hey, listen, you're coming to me with a crisis. I've got the first hour to set the foundation right. Otherwise, this whole thing goes wrong. So the golden hour tells us that in that first hour, we got to move our communications first and fast, but it also tells us we've got to frame it the right way and define the crisis in a way that makes sense to us. And that's kind of like going through the sales discovery process, right? If you discover the wrong problem, you can't sell the right solution, no matter what your solution is. And so that's pretty much what we do is we do that claim it. We work very quickly to say, this is how this problem shapes up. Here's the potential outcomes of it. And here's how we're going to move it first.
Well, I got a follow-up question to that, and it's two words: Bud Light.
Yeah.
What? How do they handle this situation? This has been going on for months, 3 months at least.
I mean, you look at Bud Light and you think about the whole thing, and it was, Scott, one can of beer.
Yeah.
If you think about it, that's really what it was. It was
Yeah.
it was a misfire in terms of not understanding your audience, right? And then when it did go wrong, they took the wrong approach in terms of crisis management. We have seen other things that get attacked, whether it's a culture war, a product misfire, whatever, that you can fix in the first hour. And they were kind of pretty tone deaf to what they were trying to do and what they were trying to sell. And I mean, Bud Light's lost, I think, $500 million in market share and sales volume since that happened.
Continues.
And I think that's a classic case of not understanding your audience and going through what your audience is really looking for and meeting the needs of your audience or your sales potential person. And that's just kind of that is really bad product management, really.
Well, wasn't a big part of that also the lady who was in charge of that or kind of fostered that? I don't remember her name, but she had been on some kind of a podcast and basically said our audience is stupid. and we don't want this frat boy image, and we're going to purposely change it. So wasn't just what they did, but it seemed to be an intent.
Yeah.
And so we have to really be careful then about everything we say these days, don't we?
Yeah, we do. And Bill, what you're getting at is kind of understanding your audience and the motivations of your audience, and not letting your audience grow organically with you. You're trying to pull your audience through to what you want them to be. And that's the mistake that you're pointing out there. From a communication standpoint, right? You can foster and grow an audience organically and grow alongside them. Mm-hmm. This is trying to change your audience. And again, that doesn't work, and that doesn't understand the kind of dynamics of what happens within a population and how populations shift and grow. Because we're all different people than we were 30 years ago or 40 years ago, right? We have different values or different things we've learned, and we act differently. But someone can't just dictate your new beliefs. And that's the problem here, that they don't go through what we would call diffusion theory. And we could walk through diffusion theory if you want, but that's the same as kind of a sales discovery process. You can't make someone go from 0 to 60 just because you want them to. They have to go through things in a certain sequence to process it. And if they can't process it, they're going to lash back at you.
So let's talk about that. I'm very involved in discovery. I think it's the most important part of the sales process. But how we ask those questions, the order we ask them, how we frame them. You use frame it as an important part of the crisis situation. Let's talk about what you would do different in a discovery process than I think many people do, which is just have a list of questions and start driving, which Scott and I laugh, an interrogation rather than a discovery. So what are some of the key things you found in discovery that we could do more effectively?
Well, let's just kind of make an example, and we'll call this character Young Scott, right? And so this is back to school season, right?
That's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago, I'm telling you. But young Scott had some very astute parents who knew that this prodigy was going to be something one day, and he's going off to kindergarten. And before he goes off to kindergarten, his parents know that at some point he's going to need something to write with, right? And so they go to a good salesperson. The salesperson says, well, tell us about young Scott. And they let them talk more than them. So they talk about young Scott, and they talk about what they've seen him do and how he acts and what he needs. And so they know there's this thing, awareness they have of young Scott needs something in this category, right? There's an interest in something. So there's an awareness and an interest that he needs something to write with or draw with or whatever it is. And what they start to do is this evaluation with him. So we go from interest, awareness, right, to evaluation. And they start saying, well, tell me more about this young Scott and what's your vision for him? And they start going through, they map this out with them, and they say, oh, okay, pencil, pen, box of crayons, the old Corolla crayons, does he need the 32 box of all the colors or the 64, or those kids I was really jealous with in school that had the 128? Does he
with the sharpener on the side?
With the sharpener on the side, right? And then they get all these things out in front of Scott and they let him try it out, right? And at some point, he kind of gravitates towards one because they're taking the time to listen to him and watch him and see what he needs. And at the end of the day, this astute salesperson knows that this is a prodigy and says, well, really what you need is our premier system, which kind of grows with you over time. And we're going to start you out with crayons. We're going to move you into pencils. Then we're going to move you into mid-range pens. And when you become Professor Plum, we're going to give you the Mont Blanc. And the parents see the vision laid out because they've taken the time to listen where it started with this young prodigy coming to the door and how something that he needs to draw with or color with or write with grows with him. And so it really is diffusion theory and process as we're doing this, which is very similar to what you guys would do in the discovery process. But we have to think about that with any time someone makes a big decision, they have to go through this process. And so you can't, in a crisis, like if you have a crisis that is very complex, a chemical spill that might be cleaned up quickly, but the remnants remain in the water for 30 or 40 years, you have to be able to explain chemical analysis and chemical compounds to people, because if they don't understand it and what it means, they're going to be afraid of it, and the crisis is going to grow. And so that's where our part of this comes in, is that we have to explain very difficult topics to people, understanding that I can't just tell them that this is the answer. My information has to flow down to them in such a way that they become the people that adopt the point of view of it and the understanding of it, and then reinforce it. The best communication systems come when we reinforce it, and I become a self-expert because you've explained it so well. In your process, your discovery process works so well that the salesperson, young Scott, he turns out to be Professor Plum. I recommend Professor Plum to my friends and reinforce the good decision that I made. And it's the same thing in diffusion theory. So I think that's why I say what I do and what you guys do is really similar. It's just in different arenas.
So we're trying to ask questions until we can get an idea of that customer's vision.
Correct.
and then replay that back to them as a solution with our product or service mixed in to say, here's how our product or service can help you attain that vision, as
Correct.
in young Scott being able to use this whole kit throughout the years rather than just in kindergarten.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've turned the vision of young Scott into something that we brought through diffusion theory. And then what we've done, like you said, Bill, we can play back the story to them. And so the other concept that we use frequently in crisis communications is what we call strategic storytelling. Think about those parents that brought young Scott to the salesperson, right? They said, hey, we've got this young prodigy that's coming into kindergarten. He's getting ready to go off and
I can see Scott's head getting bigger as we do this.
Amazing,
use this
right?
example. It's now fills the entire screen that I'm looking at. So,
but it's clear from a young age that this young Scott is going to be the next big thing, right? And so we get the stage setting, right? That is the first part of strategic storytelling, is that this is where we are today.
Mm-hmm.
And then the parents come to the sales professional and they say, well, here's the rising action. We don't know how to make this decision about what he needs in his hand to become the success. So the rising action, we take business as usual, right? Here's the steady state Scott as a prodigy, but how do we make him really form that prodigy, right? And so then there's this conflict. Do we pick the crayons, the pens, the pencils, or do we give him the premier package? So a conflict means a decision has to be made, because a conflict isn't necessarily a negative. A lot of times I tell people the conflict is the positive. So if we frame that into the story of how great do you want to make Scott, as opposed to, well, you can't go wrong with a crayon, that's two different conflicts being explained to these young parents.
Scott actually poked himself in the eye with a crayon. And so
it probably
was
did.
a long time before he got pencils. So a thought on that. I want to take you back, and I appreciate this. But don't those parents, again, come in with a preconceived notion? Maybe they got the list from the school, right? All I need is crayons and a number 2 pencil that's, as big as your arm. And that's what we need. So they're coming in with this preconceived notion, which the expert, the salesperson, knows is going to be insufficient for his future Scott. Now we have to change their mind, not just guide them.
Right. And so, Bill, that's where the last 2 paid parts of strategic storytelling exactly come in. And that's resolution and outcome. And so you're selling this story then, hey, the resolution to this is the premier package. And the outcome to this will be the future state, will be this genius we know as Professor Plum. Just give it 12 to 15 years. And so really what you're doing is you're setting up the narrative by taking everything that you've known about him in that first stage setting that they give you. You're looking through what the conflict is, and you're selling them on the vision of what it could be. That doesn't come without listening to what these parents are really telling you. If they're telling you that he's a prodigy, what are they really saying? Right? They think their boy is special. Every parent thinks their young boy is special, right? But they think there's something special here, that he just needs that one extra thing. And it's something beyond a crayon. And you've just sold them something beyond a crayon. Which, again, I mean, it sounds like kind of a silly example, but it is the process. And that's really what we do in crisis communications, is we take you from the scene setting to the resolution and outcome. And we bring you through that story in a way that makes your brain feel happy.
Yeah, let's talk about what that story does. What does that do for people, other than just, because I know a lot of us, we've dealt with customers or sales training that is, fact, benefit, nailed down, fact, here's the benefit. And people find it awful uncomfortable to tell stories. I think sometimes we want to get fact-based. I do communications training for presentations, and, they just want to layer bullet points in, by the ton. And if I hit enough bullet points, you're going to, succumb to my intelligence. But storytelling is a very different thing, and it does the brain reacts differently to it. So let's talk about how the brain reacts and why the storytelling can be so effective.
Well, and here's kind of the neuroscience of this. So if you study this, what you find is that all of us humans have a brain with the same operating system, and that operating system is based on storytelling. It's based on kind of the survival instinct of, hey, what do I need to learn to keep myself into that happy resolution and outcome? And we process it through story because that's how the information is handed down from generation to generation to generation. So your brain has a pre-wiring in its operating system to glom on to stories. And so I also tell people that facts are nice and important and they're good to have, but really what sells people, what moves them is emotion and story. We're more likely to remember a feeling. I got hit by something, I got my hand burned, whatever. I remember that feeling more than I do the fact of fire bad, right? And so that pushes me more. And so that's why, we work on strategic storytelling with clients. It's about moving emotional story. And in the case of our young Scott, I mean, the emotion tied to that is the good graces and glory of my son, who's going to be a genius one day, and what that looks like.
Right.
So facts are important pieces of the story, but the story has to be structured in such a way that it brings you happiness. It triggers kind of those emotions in your brain. I'd rather sell an emotion.
Can you give us a quick overview of that structure? Because I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with stories versus fact.
So really, it starts with stage setting. So let's think about it in 5 parts. The first one is stage setting, which is what we know about our person, place, or thing or event. What do we know about it today? What's the steady state? Then it goes to step 2, which is a rising action. There's a need, there's something that's changing. We know it's changing. It's either changing fast or slow, so it's rising to something different. And we know a decision has to be made. And conflict is just the decision point. I've got to make a decision to go this way, or that way. And I have options, and the choice I make will make a difference. And so that's why I tell people kind of knowing what the conflict really is, defining it helps people understand where it can go. So then step 4 is resolution. How do I resolve the conflict? And the outcome is what I sell in the happily ever after. What's the new normal state?
The vision.
So in crisis communication, we tell people, I need you to get through the steps 3 fast so I can get to 4 and 5, because people want the end of the story. It's kind of like I also ask clients, I mean, how many of you have ever read the last page of a book before you read the middle of the book because you want to see how it ends up? Or you read the back of a movie, of a DVD cover or something, you go, oh, here's the synopsis.
Right.
I'm going to make it out alive, right? I mean, it's a very common thing that we want the resolution and outcome, and then we'll sit through the storytelling. But that's a very common thing that people want to get to the end. And that's what you do in sales.
So do you tend to start with the conflict and build the story on both ends? So we know what the conflict is. Let's use the Scott story. He's smarter than maybe this piece of paper tells us. And so we know that we're going to need more, but we really want to follow what the teacher's guidelines are here. And that's kind of the conflict, right? Should I follow this and just get the crayons and the number 2 pencil, or should I get the whole kit so that Scott's ready for the future? And then we start there, and then we create a story or use something to set the stage and then build the rising action.
That's exactly it, Bill. So that's why we say if you claim it right, if you name the conflict correctly, you can tell the story the way it needs to be told to get the movement of the action. Because in this scenario, the school just sees Scott as an average everyday student, right? The parents see him as a prodigy, and that's the conflict. So he needs different tools to make him that prodigy come to life. So we have to go back and rewrite the story that, no, this isn't an average student, the scene setting. This is a highly productive, genius, good-looking, handsome young man coming through your door that's going to have this conflict.
What happened?
Oh my God.
What the heck happened?
The AI on this is going to be young Scott, prodigy Scott, and crayons. I mean, those are going to be the key words on this whole podcast.
Did you pay Paul for this scenario?
I don't know. How did we get here?
Well, we got here because, you're on a podcast with the one and only Professor Plum, right? It didn't just happen by accident, right? There's a narrative built into the name of Professor Plum, right? It probably started earlier than he thought.
Well, yeah. And people have said, has anybody ever come after you with, the game of Clue and Professor Plum? I said, not yet, but I want a jury trial.
I want a big deal about it.
I don't want a judge to decide. I want 12 of my peers to decide.
On video.
Exactly.
Let's get this on tape.
Yeah, within that environment, Paul, and this might be kind of the closing question, is in addition to conflict, there's contrast, there's context, and there's other influences that go into making a decision and managing conflict. How does other people deal with that and controlling that, either offensively or defensively? Is there any techniques in that area?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Scott. So really what we have to play to is that I also tell my clients, and my new line in any crisis plan I write is there's strategy number one now, which didn't exist 20 or 30 years ago, which is to learn to live with discomfort. And
Mm,
what I mean by that is that audiences have become so kind of, especially here in the United States, gotten so kind of bifurcated, and you can watch a media outlet and find any type of news you want these days, right? Left, right,
Yeah.
center, right. I mean, it's a crazy proliferation. And so I always tell people you're not going to make everybody happy. So what you have to do is think about who's the audience that you care about the most, that you need to influence the most, and what's reasonable to reach that audience.
Hmm.
And so I tell my clients, you got to learn to live with some discomfort. Whereas before, we could get three-fourths of the population to agree with us or more. Now we're lucky if we get two-thirds or half. And so we've just seen that happen. And so you got to be more consistent in kind of understanding the demographic and the psychographic makeup of the audiences you're dealing with. So that's a great question because it's changed, it's shifted. And we're seeing more kind of this discernment, not just like political and social, but also product wise. Is it a Bud Light thing where I buy this product, and it's going to make other people mad? Or is it this other type of product line? So what you're selling, you got to learn with more, live with more discomfort.
So, Paul, as we wrap up today, you have some offers, anything that you want to, communication you want to get so our audience can get hold of you?
Well, here's the funny thing. I can tell you, just like you guys said, everybody waits till last week of the month for salespeople.
yeah.
My clients come to me on Friday most consistently because it's the last day of the week and they don't want to ruin their weekend. And they've been thinking about something for a long time. And someone says, "Hey, I refer you to this guy named Paul. He can handle this for you." So Friday becomes my busiest day. So what I always tell people is, hey, look, go to my website. It's omottandassociates.com. That's OMODT and associates.com. And just bookmark me because when you need me, you want to find me fast.
Right.
And so I always tell clients there's no harm in calling me. The first hour is always free because I'd rather help you than see you burn and crash later. And so many of the best work I ever do, Bill and Scott, you never see. And
Right.
what I mean by that is that we get a story out there faster that's better for our client than if something morphs the other way and it's a bad story told. And
Mm.
so the best work you do in crisis communications, people don't see. And it's really hard to say, well, this could have happened, but here's how we stopped it, or here's how we shaped up that story. And there was no damage done to the organization or to the person. And so that's the side of the equation I like to be on. So call me sooner than a Friday, or find me on the internet.
All right. So we'll put on your website on our show page, Paul, and your phone number. So if people want to get hold of you.
Perfect.
Well, Paul, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. Great information, understanding how crisis communication and sales discovery really tie into one another. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Our golden nugget for today is you must look within for value, but you must look beyond for perspective, by Dennis Waitley. Remember Dennis back in the day?
I love Dennis Waitley. He tells a great story about trying to feed his baby. If you ever get that story,
Oh, wow. I haven't heard that.
That's he was a fighter pilot, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So it's a great story. Anyway, yeah, I guess I'm not sure what that means. Scott, tell me what that quote means. You always have hard quotes. I do easy ones.
I try to make it in context of the topic, and we must look within for value. So we must look at ourselves, look within ourselves, look at our perspective of ourselves, but we must look beyond ourselves for perspective to see how that value can be applied in other areas and hopefully increased. When we deliver more of who we are to somebody that finds it more valuable, then the value increases. It's like the story of water. You can go to
water's good.
Yeah, water. I mean, at an airport or Las Vegas, I mean, you can get $6 for a bottle of water. But, you go to Costco and you get, $2 for a case of water. It's just really different as to the value of the water depending on where you are. That
All
point.
right, super. All right, good. Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah.
All this information, Paul's contact information will all be at winningatselling.com. And this is episode 578.
Next week, we're going to be doing the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, Part 4, Chapters 4, 5, and 6. And our topic is going to be the top 6 sales challenges based on ChatGPT. So we're going to be relevant and in the modern age of AI. Please subscribe and share this podcast with your colleagues and others on social media.
Go out and get better one skill at a time.
Joyful selling.